It's 25 years since Israel pulled out of the Sinai, leaving Egypt with a land of endless possibilities. What's come of those hopes and dreams, and what does the future hold? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm David Foster. It was a time of triumph and great hope. Egypt won back the Sinai from Israel in 1982, 15 years after it had been lost in the Six-Day War. The desert peninsula hangs off the east of Egypt. Its name is as old as written history itself and is recorded in the Bible, the Quran and the Torah. But today, despite its famed resorts and its coral reefs, much of the peninsula is impoverished and threatened by extremism. So how did Sinai get to this? Lucy Ashton has more.
The Israelis watch as their flag is lowered for the last time over the Sinai Peninsula 25 years ago. In its place, the new Egyptian president, Hosni Mubarak, triumphantly hoists his own country's flag, marking the end of Israel's occupation of Sinai. 15 years earlier, Tel Aviv's tanks raced across the desert, seizing the entire peninsula and laying siege to the Suez Canal. Winning back the Sinai became an Egyptian obsession, critical to restoring the nation's pride. Cairo's diplomats made the return of Sinai the cornerstone of the peace agreement between the two nations. But even after the deal was done, the Israeli settlers didn't go without a fight. Many were arrested and dragged shouting across the border. But the Egyptians were ecstatic. A plan was soon underway to channel the waters of the Nile, to make the desert green. Sinai was a land of hope. Thousands were encouraged to flee the cramped conditions of the Nile Valley for a new home. New jobs were promised. Egypt's only coal mine opened in the north. Millions of dollars were invested in building tourist resorts in the south. Today, Sinai has come a long way. It's now a glistening international tourism destination and a center for global conferences. However, unemployment and poverty remain massive problems, especially for the nomadic Bedouins who have lived in the region for centuries. Nevertheless, more money is rolling in, especially as European developers, with Egyptian partners, are driving up real estate values along the coastline. The Sinai appears set for a bright future, but the question remains, who will reap the rewards?
Join us now, our guest Gamal Abdul Gawad, who's a senior research fellow at Al-Hakram Strategic Studies Centre, as well as a political science professor at the American University in Cairo. Hugh Roberts, formerly of the International Crisis Group and a specialist on North Africa, who's based in Cairo. And finally, Al Jazeera's Cairo correspondent, Amr Al-Khaki. Amr, if I could come to you first of all, two questions. Why does the Sinai matter to Egypt, and what's the place really like?
David, Sinai, of course, is so important because it is strategic. It's the point where Asia and Africa merge. It's full of potential oil, minerals, and other things. And it's the eastern gate to Egypt. That's the gate from which Egypt was usually invaded since the pharaonic era, the several dynasties. And that's the reason for which it is so important to Egypt. Most of the invasions came from there. That northeastern gate to Egypt is the most important and the key to the strategic security of Egypt. Now, Sinai is a vast barren land, apart from those areas in the north and south that have been developed over the past 25 years with huge funds from Egyptian and multinational investors. Overlooking the Suez Gulf, the Aqaba Gulf, and overlooking the Suez Canal, having beaches on the Mediterranean. It is so important, and it's full of, a population of hundreds of thousands. We're talking about over 200,000, of course, in the north and the south, but the north is most populated, and it's been the scene for the conflict between Egypt and Israel over the past 5 decades.
Hugh Roberts, it's a playground. It's now a very rich area, a place to which very rich people seem to go. Yet when you were with the International Crisis Group, you saw a major problem there. What was that?
Well, first of all, it's not very rich. The area that has been developed essentially for tourism in the south is, of course, prosperous. But North Sinai is one of the poorest governorates in Egypt. That point should be borne in mind, particularly when we take into account the fact that most of the people involved in the terrorism came from North Sinai. So we should bear that element of continuing poverty and underdevelopment in the north in mind. Our basic point in looking at this issue in the International Crisis Group was to consider what lies underneath the symptom of terrorism. Terrorism, of course, can sometimes just be a few angry men doing something of their own initiative. But what was interesting and worrying about the terrorism that developed since 2004 is that it continues.
For our viewers' benefit, these were the attacks that killed a great many people in the resort towns of the Sinai.
That's right. The first attack was in October 2004 in Taba. Then there was an attack at Sharm el-Sheikh in July 2005. And then another attack a year ago, April of last year, in Dahab. So that means that this organization kept going for over 18 months and clearly benefited from local complicities in some degree. So what we decided to do was to look at the general social and economic condition of the region. And we found that this left quite a lot to be desired. There was quite a lot of resentment, and this is something we felt the Egyptian authorities needed to look at and take into account. And
a lot of it has been perhaps because of frustrations, unemployment, difficulties in living conditions for the nomadic people who were around there. Made their home in the desert for so many generations, and it's worth explaining now a little bit more about them. I think the image of the desert nomad, it's always captured outsiders' imaginations when it comes to the Middle East. But of Egypt's population of 72 million, it's only just a fraction, around 500,000, who are actually Bedou. Around 200,000 of those live in Sinai, where they form the majority, and the 20 tribes, well, they've got no common ethnicity. Some originate in the Arabian Peninsula, others come from Turkey, Africa, even parts of Eastern Europe. And significantly, many have cross-border family ties in Israel, Gaza, and Jordan. Most no longer nomadic. The urban development that we've talking about and the tourist boom have deprived many of them, most of them indeed, of access to vital water supplies in the desert and traditional grazing rights. And some of them have had to turn their Bedouin heritage into a tourist attraction, but many more very poor. We've talked about unemployment and subsequently ill health. They're rife, and it's poverty that's been cited as fueling any links between the Bedou of the Sinai and both Islamic and Palestinian militants. Let's turn to Gamal Abdul Gawad from the American University in Cairo, who's been studying this. Would it be fair to say, when it comes to the nomadic tribes, to the Bedou, the vast majority of Egyptians really don't care very much about what happens to them?
I don't think this is fair. It's fair to say this statement or to make it. And it's also not fair to depict the people of Sinai as if it is a kind of a different ethnic group. But you talk about a large society like the Egyptian society with over 75 million people. Perhaps it is made up of a number of subcultures, in fact. Yes, we have some kind of the Egyptian identity and the Egyptian national culture, etc. But at the same time, within this culture, you have different subcultures. You go north on the coastal areas or in the delta or in upper Egypt, you have different subcultures. And definitely the people of Sinai have their own subcultures within this overall Egyptian culture.
But it is fair to point out that in the last few years, the Egyptian government has encouraged people from the Nile Delta, from the wealthier part of your country and the overcrowded part, to move to the Sinai, thereby sort of, if not outnumbering, then certainly sort of subsuming some of the local people, the Bedou themselves.
Well, implicitly, I don't know, in this question is that if within the same country some kind of barriers should be established for people mobility. I think this is one important characteristic of a nation state, that people have access to the entire territory of this state. So if people move from the Nile Delta or the valley to Sinai. This is still something that's very much acceptable in any nation state, sovereign nation state. The issue is not this. The issue is that the magnitude of development that has taken place in Sinai after the end of the Israeli occupation was far beyond the capacity of the local population there. This development, fast and rapid development in Sinai, wasn't only driven by economic concerns, but also was driven by security concerns. It was there was a kind of a mutual understanding between Egypt and Israel under the mediation of the United States that Sinai should be turned into a development area so that it will be a kind of a confidence building measures between Egypt and Israel, that it will not be used again in the future for further military conflicts between the two countries. And also for Egypt, this became a kind of a part of its defense strategy. Instead of having Sinai a barren, empty, or very low density population living there, just to bring as much people as you can there and turn it into a prosperous part of the country, so that it will enhance the overall security of Egypt.
Let me bring up a point that is made in the report by the International Crisis Group, which says that describes Sinai as a geographical crossroads subject to military regimes where, and this is the point, the general euphoria following the return to Egypt in 1982 of the area vanished quickly as the central government neglected its populations. What do you mean by that, Hugh Roberts?
Well, I think, let me first of all say I very much agree with Gamal Abdel Gawad on his point that Egyptians are free to move around anywhere within Egypt, and therefore there's absolutely nothing wrong at all with people from the Nile Valley moving into the Sinai. The problem that has arisen there is that the local population feel that they are drawing the short straw, that they are getting little or nothing out of the economic development that is occurring, and that it is the newcomers that are being favored. So the problem is not that people are coming into Sinai from the Nile Valley, but that the local population feel that they are being discriminated against. Now, I think that this partly links up with your question about the military aspect, which is, of course, a natural feature of Sinai given its enormous sensitive security significance over all these years. The problem here is that there's a tendency, I think, for the way in which the region is governed to be, if anything, even more authoritarian than the rest of the country, with the local population really not getting consulted. There's a tendency
Roberts, I'm going
to
interrupt you there, and I'm going to say to Gamal Abdel Gawad that we will, I saw you nodding your head, we will come back to you in just a moment to get some extra points, but we're going to take a short break. When we return, we'll be taking a closer look at what reasons from without and within are behind those attacks on the Sinai in recent years. Stay with us, if you will, on Inside Story.